Well, good morning and good afternoon to Sarah. Beautiful dappled sunlight in here. I think you can see it comes across well on Zoom on the floor. After the Buddha awakened under the Bodhi tree, he came down and met the five ascetics he'd practiced austerities with for a number of years. And he'd left them realizing that taking that very austere path wasn't really a way towards a kind of a deep happiness or joy. But after he awakened under the Bodhi tree and came down and met with them, they could see that there was something different about him. They could see that he had a kind of ease, a serenity, kind of a groundedness, a confidence, but a joyful ease. They could feel something had profoundly changed in him, and so they were receptive, which was great, because then he gave his first sermon, his first teaching, the Four Noble Truths. And we haven't really talked about them for a while, so I thought we could just go over the Four Noble Truths a little bit today. So the four truths, the first one is dukkha, which translates as suffering, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There's never any word that successfully captures reality, so whatever word is used in these translations never quite hits the mark, but we just have to make do with what we can. So we use the word suffering for the first noble truth, and then there's a cause, the second noble truth, that there is a cause of that suffering. And the third noble truth is that there is cessation of suffering. And the fourth noble truth is there is a way to that cessation. There is a way to not suffer what you could say is unnecessarily. So we just go back to dukkha. Comes from the Sanskrit word for a wheel being out of kilter. I think this is a very helpful image. If you think about a wheel on a cart not being true, the wheel would turn kind of either with a bit of a bump, a repetitive bump, or maybe a bit of a wobble. So if you were on a cart with the wheel that was out of kilter, even if you could still move along, there'd just be this kind of uncomfortable thing going on. This bump, 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 or this wobble, wobble, wobble. It would just be there. And another way to think of a wheel out of kilter is if you think of a potter's wheel. If the potter's wheel is out of kilter a little bit, you maybe still could make a bowl or a cup, but it would be kind of hard. It would just not quite work. So this word dukkha has got this quality, sort of a restless dissatisfaction, just an unease that's kind of hovering. So we use the word suffering for dukkha. And the suffering, the Buddha made it very clear, the suffering isn't to do with the actual externalities of life. It's not out of kilter because we can get sick and we grow old and we can die and do die. That's not the thing that's out of kilter. What's out of kilter is our mind's relationship to the everyday, inevitable pains of everyday life. There's just pains in everyday life. The being out of kilter, the being like on a cart that's the wheel is just burdum, burdum, burdum in this sort of annoying way, is to do with our mind's relationship. Our mind's relationship to life's difficulties. Because inevitably things go wrong for us. You know, as children, we get scraped knees and stubbed toes, and other kids at school maybe reject us and run away from us. As we grow older, we maybe don't get the job that we want, or we don't get the grade that we want. Relationships fall apart. Things are not stable. It's not that they're completely unstable. They're generally, there's a sort of a general, for most of us, a general stability, but it's not completely reliable. We all know this. It's not completely reliable. And I think part of the difficulty is because we can influence the phenomenal world, because we can influence things, we mistake that influence for control, and trying to control things and really thinking it's possible to control things, and then things turning out not to be controllable. That's the wheel that's out of kilter. That's the bump. That's the wobble. And yet people do spend often their whole lives trying to get everything under control. So the skill is working a way of living where we still do influence things to the benefit of ourselves and others, you know, in a wholesome way, understanding that we actually don't have ultimately control over these things, and being able to move with that, flex with that. So I just recently acquired this book, Before Buddha Was Buddha. It's a series of the tales, the Jataka tales, the tales of Buddha's life before he was Shakyamuni Buddha, before he was Gautama Siddhartha, before that, all the lives, you know, not all the lives. This is just a collection of some of the stories of his lives before he was the historical Buddha. And it's kind of interesting, nice to read some of these stories, because it's sort of, in some of the stories, he's a very compassionate and caring person, or in some of the stories, he's an animal, the deer, who's very caring for the other deer in the herd. There's all these different stories. In some of them, he makes mistakes and things don't quite go right. And it's kind of it's nice for us to read these stories, because then we can just track across our own life, just in this lifetime, and see the times in which we fell down and got up and we made a mistake and we learned from it, or we made a mistake and didn't learn from it and had to make it again. You know, all of these things. And that if we keep ourselves, if we have a mind that is aware and is paying attention, then practice happens and wisdom grows, and suffering, this kind of restless suffering, diminishes. So these stories kind of tell of the many, many ways in which the Buddha in past lives met with difficulty, and how that deepened his wisdom so that he could be the historical Buddha that he became. So the first story, which is familiar to many of us, but it relates to the Four Noble Truths. So, just short. Prince Siddhartha, the crisis of leaving home. Approaching the age of 30, the Prince Siddhartha Gautama decided to leave the protection of his palace and head out, for the first time, legends say, onto the streets of his city. There, over a 4-day period, he dramatically encountered what are called the 4 ego-devastating signs. We'll come back to that, 4 ego-devastating signs. He sees a sick man and for the first time is appalled to discover that everyone gets sick. He sees an old man and is horrified to discover that all get old. He sees a dead man and is shocked to learn that even the most privileged die. Then he sees a truth seeker, a yogi, or perhaps a wandering hermit monk, and realizes that there is a path leading to something more. Sheltered as he's been, he's never known these things before. After taking it all in, despite the luxuries he's been accustomed to, with great resolution, he abandons his home, determined to find that greater truth and bring back something of value for all, or die in the attempt. So it's interesting here that in this story, it says of 4 devastating signs: old age, sickness, and death. But then the 4th one is this, what's called a truth seeker here, but you could say someone who is at ease, someone who is truly, deeply at ease with the knowledge of old age, sickness, and death. And that someone who's truly at ease with old age, sickness, and death, which you could just call the insecurity of life or impermanence, that is an ego-devastating sign, which is very interesting. What is it about someone who's completely at ease that means the Buddha would describe them as ego-devastating? And I think we could say is a person who's completely at ease with that, has let go of a sense of themselves as a separate individual that has to be kind of shored up and have scaffolding built all around it to try and stop it from falling apart. That someone at ease with old age, sickness, and death is okay with the flux of life, and can find joy, and not just joy, but actually deep appreciation with the fact that everything is in constant flux. So I'll read a little bit of the commentary that's here about this story. When Prince Siddhartha walked out of his palace and found that everything is as impermanent as dust on the wind, he was plunged into despair. And sometimes people do get plunged into despair and stay in despair. But it says here, then he rallied, determined to live with open eyes and without taking refuge in trance, fantasy, cynicism, or hedonism. His driving question became, is there a path based on facts that leads to freedom now? Is there a path based on facts that leads to freedom now? With his experience of the 4 signs, aging, sickness, death, and a truth seeker, Siddhartha's road to world rule was demolished, because as many of us would know, he was destined to become a great ruler, either a great ruler or a great religious figure. And his father didn't want him to become a great religious figure. He wanted him to become a great ruler, and so sheltered him from inconveniences of everyday life. But he couldn't shelter him, just like we can't shelter ourselves. Shocked, dismayed, and then determined to find an answer, he left his home, wife, newborn son, father, foster mother, and all his luxuries and attendants. He may have felt as well as some sense that he was being pushed by circumstance onto the very road he'd been unconsciously seeking all along. He wasn't running away, but trying to find that way that would benefit all, including his wife and child. His faith in what had been familiar and comfortable had now been shattered. I was thinking too that at some point, all of us as children, at some point, we do kind of get some idea about mortality at some point. I can't remember when I realized that people die exactly. I don't remember. But I do remember as a child becoming aware that people were vulnerable. I grew up with a lot of television. I remember watching television and being quite worried about all the characters in the shows that I was watching, both the good guys and the bad guys, as so many TV shows are. People are broken up that way, good guys and bad guys. But I remember being worried about them, like, but they'll be cold in that jail cell. Aren't they going to get something to eat? You know, I'd worry about them. So somewhere along the line, that childish sense of one can live forever, kind of, you don't even think about it, you just feel immortal as a child. At some point we start to realize that's not the case. But also what happens to so many people is that realization is there as a child. And then often what parents do is because they love their children, they try and sort of like push that away. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. And after a while, so often that kind of sort of philosophical mind that children have, it often kind of gets covered over and clouded over, and they forget about it, and they move into what from a societal perspective is a kind of a distraction from the insecurities of life. It's like trying to keep ahead of the wave, keeping ahead of it. So I'll just continue reading a bit here. We all know exactly how that feels. This is referring to sort of realizing that maybe our childish sense of immortality isn't true. At some point, we each have our own insight into this devastation. Thinking that disillusionment is final truth, some become stuck there. Many, trying to hide from this new insight, seek distractions. Perhaps much of the gross national product is the result of a mass flight from reality, driven by repressed anxiety over the inescapable truths of sickness, aging, and death. Some seek to amass not only possessions, but power as their bulwark against the defeat that deep down we all know is heading for us with the relentless pace of the ticking clock. Prince Siddhartha's response is something different. He does not turn and run. He does not try to repress what he knows to be true. He does not hide, attempting to build a bigger, better, even more sheltering palace. He does not become enraged, taking out his despair on others. Instead, he allows himself to be emotionally naked, letting everything he'd once thought to be drop away. I like that, the emotionally naked. Experiencing the anguish of the First Noble Truth, he courageously lets go of all that he'd known, which is in itself a kind of awakening. So this First Noble Truth, dukkha, or suffering, it's not pessimistic and it's not optimistic either. It's just realistic. It's just this very straightforward. If we can, in a very straightforward, go like, yeah, when you're born with the body, things will go wrong. You will bleed, you will bruise. It's not bad. It's not good. It just is. And in a way, you could say it's good, because when we really deeply understand how impermanent everything is, how sort of beautifully vulnerable everything is, our appreciation for things really increases. We can appreciate every day that we're we're alive, that we can be aware, just that we can hear and see and feel. It's just a magnificent thing. And so rather than what so often happens, people worry about the future and try to not think about it by escaping through the various ways that they do. By accepting it, we can actually just fully appreciate every single moment that we're alive. And then the quality of our life is so much greater. It's deep appreciation. And we can appreciate every day that people that we love are alive. Sometimes people's children don't even live one day. So if our child has lived for 5 years, or for 10 years, for 15 years, it's just something to be incredibly grateful for. If we've been alive for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. I remember about a year ago, I accidentally upset my mother. I think I must have been contemplating this too much. She's 88 and she was worried about her health. And I said, "Oh, well, you've had a pretty good run." She got very upset with me and I apologized. And then I explained where I was coming from and she understood a little bit. And actually it reminded me of a song called Cup of Coffee. And it's a song about a young couple, and the young man is dying. We don't know what of in the song, but you imagine of some illness. And there's a couple of lines in the song that I really like. He says, "My life was kinda short, but I got so many blessings. Happy you are mine, sucks that it's all ending." And I love this, my life was kind of short, but I got so many blessings. You know, for a young man in his early 20s to be knowing that he's going to die and being there with his girlfriend, to be able to say that, my life was kind of short, but I got so many blessings. That's exactly the flavor of what the Buddha is trying to teach us here with these Four Noble Truths. And yet he can also say, it sucks that it's all ending. Because yeah, it's very sad to die prematurely. But that's dukkha. That's us being able to just see and accept the mere fact of things. Well, actually, seeing the mere fact of things is what causes us not to have this extra suffering, which we're going to go into here. Oh gosh. So on Friday mornings, we chant Setting in Motion the Wheel of Dharma, one of our sutras that we chant, and it goes, one part goes, association with the unpleasant is suffering, separation from the pleasant is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering, in brief, grasping the five aggregates is suffering. So another way to talk about the five aggregates in this context is being pulled about by our mind's desires, believing our mind's thoughts and being pulled around by the desires of the mind is suffering. But this line, not to get what one wants is suffering, is just such a great encapsulation that what the Buddha taught wasn't that suffering is the things that we do or don't get, it's our attitude, it's the wanting, the clinging and the aversion that creates the problem for us. It's okay to want something if there's no harm in having that thing and that thing is available. There's nothing wrong with that. But when we want something that either is harmful or we want something that isn't available, well, then we're going to suffer. And many of us do this to ourselves a lot. We want something to be other than what it is, and we aren't actually in a position to change it, but we keep wanting it to change, and we suffer. And this is kind of visually demonstrated with the parable of the second arrow. When something unfortunate happens, it's like two arrows get shot towards us. The first arrow hits and it hurts, and that's the arrow of the thing that didn't go that went wrong, whatever that might be. Like, I had a flat tire this morning, which is why I got to the Zendo a little bit late. I got in my van, timing it just right to get here, and like, oh, the car's not moving properly. And a completely flat tire. But luckily, someone was able to give me a ride, and I got here only a few minutes late. So had my mind gone, oh, God, of all times to get a flat tire, why do I get a flat tire when I'm just heading to the Zendo? I wish I didn't have this flat tire. This would have created a whole lot of turmoil. And so the first arrow is just the flat tire. It may be painful. In this instance, it really wasn't anyway. It was just a flat tire. But the first arrow is just what it is. The second arrow is all of our thoughts about it, and as we can imagine, the second arrow would hurt a lot, especially if it just it's right on top of the first one. It'd be very painful. And much of our suffering, much of our experience of discomfort is actually this second arrow. Far more often, it's the second arrow. I'm sure we can find exceptions, in people in extreme situations of war. Maybe you could say, okay, it's just lots of first arrows. It's truly so in some circumstances. It's just, they're just getting shot with arrows over and over and over. But in general, it's the second arrow that we shoot ourselves that really, really hurts. It's that second arrow that really hurts. So in Zazen, we can really examine this. We can notice what we do with our minds. And this is all very good news, because we don't have control so much of the externalities, but we have this incredible capacity to train our mind and get to know our mind. We really can do that. There are people who don't have very much mental anguish. There are people who have practiced for years and they are equanimous, truly and genuinely so. And all of us can become more like that. And not only do we benefit, but everybody around us benefits from that. It really benefits everybody when we can find a way to not shoot ourselves with this second arrow. It's not just a sort of a mythical thing that's possible in the far distant future. We can do this. Zazen helps a lot. It's harder to do it without some kind of discipline. We need some kind of disciplined practice. And in our school, in our tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, it's Zazen, it's meditation. Observing the mind. Observing the mind in this kind of dispassionate way. And that's very helpful in daily life, because when something happens like this flat tire this morning, I think because I practiced long enough, I didn't even have to go through any of these steps. But, maybe one would go through the initial step of going, God, flat tire, what time is it? But then one could then go like, take a breath. Take a breath. It's okay, even if you're late. Nothing terrible will happen. No one will get hurt. We can do that. We can sort of calm ourselves down. If we've been practicing, we can do that. And of course, these are the little things, but if we can work with the little things, when the big things happen, we can deal with the big things with greater skill, which is less suffering for us, less suffering for others, if we can deal with the really difficult things. If we can be the one when the difficult things happen that remains not sort of like steady in a cold kind of way, but can just be calm, steady, caring, beneficial when maybe those around are kind of falling apart. If we could be that person. So this is the teaching of the third noble truth, that cessation of suffering is possible. It's not just an idea. Many people have been able to walk on this earth with difficult things happen to them and to happen to those around them, and do it with a skillful equanimity, where they're beneficial and helpful to others and not full of anguish. It is really possible. And everything in between, we don't have to try and leap to be like some of the great teachers in history, and some of the great teachers in recent history, like Thich Nhat Hanh, for example. It's a great example of someone who passed just less than 2 years ago. We can move in that direction. We don't need to be disappointed that we're not there. We can move in that direction. Each moment is a fresh moment to move in that direction. So we don't have time to go over it today, but maybe just for a future talk, it might be nice to mention that the fourth noble truth is there is a way for this cessation of suffering to happen for us, and we call it the Noble Eightfold Path. And again, we chant that too in our sutras. Right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So of course, the key word here is the word right, and it begins with right view. If we have right view, all the rest kind of fall into place. So right view is the foundation. And there's a lot of ways to talk about what right view is. I was thinking about two words, impermanence and permeability. Two different words, but they've got some similar sounds in them. And they're both gateways to this right view. If we look at impermanence very, very closely, we see that everything is in flux all the time. And if we really see that everything is in flux, we start to see that there isn't actually any discrete separate thing. If everything's always in flux, it's not an actual thing. It's not static at any moment in time. So if we examine impermanence very closely, we start to see that there's a breakdown between the boundary of one thing and another thing. Or even probably a good reflection initially is even just within the self. If we see ourself as in just a constant state of flux, then we can't quite find a beginning or an end to us. We can't find something static that is me. So contemplating impermanence helps dissolve the boundary between ourself and others. It starts to dissolve that boundary. And that brings us to the teaching of no self. And this, like the 4 ego devastating signs mentioned right at the beginning here. We can forget about ourselves as a separate, discrete entity and rather see ourselves as this sort of intimately undivided with everything else. A lot of self-concern just starts to evaporate. We don't have to try, it just starts to evaporate. So impermanence is one way to right view, and then I just thought permeability is a similar sounding word. And permeability does the same thing. You start to see that everything sort of interpenetrates every other thing. And then the whole question of security starts to become kind of crazy. Like, what is it that we are trying to get security for? Who am I trying to get security for? What am I worried about? Even we start to not worry so much about death, because who is it that's going to die anyway? Where am I going to go when I die anyway? where did I come from in the first place? You start to just feel intimately connected with everything, this sort of sense of a fixed thing that's going to arrive and going to pass, and that is terrifying. All of that starts to dissolve with this right view. So I think I'll stop there and see if anyone would like to comment or ask a question. Please feel free to do so.